Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual event hosted by the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. My name is Tuqa Nusayrat, and I am Deputy Director of the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East and Middle East programs here at the Atlantic Council. We're very delighted that you could join us today for this important discussion. Today, the report we're launching is the culmination of several years of a project looking at the US-Saudi relationship. The project began in mid-2017, 3 years after the 2014 economic crisis that prompted Saudi Arabia to revamp its plans for economic transformation under the auspices of King Salman and his son Prince Mohammed bin Salman. At the Rafiq Hariri Center, we focus on the human development and economic challenges facing the region, while studying the factors that can allow citizens to reach their fullest potential. So while the Middle East is often viewed through a security lens, the upheaval that led to widespread protests across the region in 2011 stemmed from lack of economic opportunity and demands for personal freedoms, among other demands. And Saudi Vision 2030, with its mandate to diversify and build a thriving economy through programs that improve education, provide greater opportunities for women to join the workforce, and strengthen the business environment, just to name a few of the plan's objectives, has a mission that focuses on the same issues that we're examining. So despite real differences between the United States and Saudi Arabia on a range of human rights issues, this is an area where we have similar interests in seeing Saudis succeed economically and can work together on these issues. This is the context in which we undertook this project and the spirit in which my colleagues Steve Grant and Catherine Wolf wrote this report. I should also mention that in addition to this report, the project also centered on several dialogue sessions between non-governmental Saudi and US policy professionals in order to discuss the areas where we can build open lines of communications and discuss issues of mutual interest and importance, including economic reform. So Steve and Catherine will speak more about their approach to this research, but of course, all of us at the Council went into this project realizing that national economic transformation is a huge policy issue with many aspects, and thus today's authors have tried to pull in a number of experts from within the Council and beyond to discuss these issues and provide feedback on their research. In the same vein, we're glad to have today's panelists here to provide their own dissent, nuance, or agreement. So thank you all for engaging with us on this important topic. I also want to take a moment to thank the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies for hosting our US delegations for meetings in Riyadh, and to the Smith Richardson Foundation that supported this project and made both the dialogues and the report possible. In a moment, I will hand over the program to Catherine and Steve, who will give a brief presentation on their report, and then our panelists will engage in a moderated discussion. After a round or two of questions with each speaker, we'll open up the questions to the audience, which you can submit via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I want to take a moment to congratulate Steve and Catherine on this detailed and comprehensive report that has been a year in the making, and on their leadership of the dialogues that informed this research. Despite the snags that coronavirus contributed over the last few months to all of our work, we're very excited to share this product with many of you tuning in from the US and around the world. Thank you all for logging in, and let's get started.
Hi, I'm Catherine Wolf. I am an associate director here at the Atlantic Council, and I just want to thank Tuka for that very kind introduction, not to mention her support. As she mentioned, this has been a long process to get here, and I'm grateful to her for bringing me onto this project, not to mention welcoming me into the council several years ago. By the same token, many thanks go to Steve Grant for being such a wonderful collaborator and a fantastic lead for this project. It's been such a pleasure to work with you, and I feel very lucky to have had the chance to do so. Now, jumping right in, I'll start with a little bit more detail about why we think this topic is important and why we took this project on. From our perspective, Saudi Arabia's stability and economic transformation are critical both for its 30+ million population, as well as for the stability of the Gulf and the wider region. The importance of diversifying Saudi Arabia's economy to lessen its reliance on oil is recognized in the conceit of the Vision 2030, the model of depending on oil revenues to fund the Saudi government, and by extension, to ensure the stability of the economy and its political system is not sustainable indefinitely. There are many debates about when the world will see peak demand, and Saudi Arabia is certainly in a very good position to continue producing for a long time at low costs. But experts tend to agree that that day is coming, and probably sooner than the oil producers of the world would like. Saudi Arabia has a window now to do the hard work of economic diversification and transformation, while it has a deep well to draw on and a leadership with the mandate to make big changes. The United States and Saudi Arabia have a long history and, we believe, future of strategic bilateral relations. It is in the interest of both countries to foster and maintain these open, candid channels of communication, even beyond current government to government channels. So we undertook this multifaceted project, as Tuka mentioned, one that included dialogues as well as this report, as an investment in this future bilateral relationship and in the future leaders of both of our countries. How did we approach this project? So to speak a little bit about the dialogues, the first phase of this project was a US Saudi strategic consultation program between next generation US and Saudi foreign policy leaders in collaboration with the King Faisal Center as a local partner and host. These dialogues were designed to build relationships between US and Saudi counterparts through candid, off the record conversations focused on the future of Saudi reform efforts as well as issues of regional security. The primary activities of this program were two US delegations of national security professionals who visited Riyadh for day long discussions with younger, influential Saudis outside of the government, hosted, as I mentioned, by the King Faisal Center, and complemented by meetings with select Saudi officials who are focused on reform issues. The other part of this project, which is why we are here today, is this report, which analyzes progress towards Saudi Vision 2030's implementation so far and offers recommendations going forward. In writing this paper, we drew on our conversations at the King Faisal Center and with these implementing officials for the Saudi Vision 2030, as well as other interviews with US experts on energy, economics, and foreign policy, official Saudi statistics and Vision 2030 plans, economic data from international institutions, comparative national surveys, and more. So in structuring the report, you can see if you look through it, the report includes a review of the origins of the Saudi Vision 2030 and the challenges that the country faces, an explanation of the content of the government's plans, a thorough review of all of these projects, programs, and entities implementing reform, analysis of progress against the vision's key performance indicators and against broader macroeconomic indicators, as well, and then finally, recommendations to keep Saudi Arabia on track towards a more sustainable economic model as envisioned in the Saudi Vision 2030 reform plan. One point I want to highlight is that our focus in this assessment was to identify Saudi Arabia's own goals and own 2020 benchmarks for the vision plan, and as best we could, compare these benchmarks, the key performance indicators that I mentioned, against metrics that are available. In some cases, particularly in fiscal management, the Saudi government has published its progress towards these KPIs, and in others, the KPI is related to an external metric, such as the World Bank's ease of doing business indicators or statistics like the unemployment rate. We came away with a lot of data and a lot of detail about the projects Saudi Arabia has undertaken as part of this reform plan. But I certainly don't want to get you in the impression that we have captured it all, because both the volume and the breadth of the vision are extensive, and because there aren't metrics available for all of the KPIs that are set in the Vision 2030. What we do find is there's so much going on under this Vision 2030 banner. There are different implementation plans, different offices, directors, funds, mobile applications, festivals, and a lot more, some of which you have almost certainly read about in the news, and other aspects that are maybe not as exciting for the news, but we have put them in this report because we think they're representative. We do offer, as you'll see in the length, a lot of examples that show where Saudi Arabia is focusing its efforts, second, where it's seen the most success, And third, the sheer volume of the program's activities that are supporting the Vision 2030. This research project allowed us to dive into what Saudi Arabia is doing across multiple fronts and come to several conclusions about the implementation of the reform program, and lastly, to make some recommendations for US and Saudi policymakers. Now I'll turn to Steve to talk more about our findings and recommendations.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you for being such a great partner in this undertaking. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for everyone else for joining us. A particular thanks to Catherine for being such a superb partner in this undertaking. Saudi Arabia has a rare window for reform, something countries often don't get but once a generation. It has a relatively new king and crown prince. The social reforms that they have implemented, which we will discuss, appear to have brought them a good deal of popular support, and the country still has significant cash reserves. But this window won't remain open forever. The collapse of oil prices twice in the last 6 years, in 2014 and again this spring, should be taken as a sign that the era of $100 per barrel oil is likely a thing of the past, and that we will hit peak demand for oil at some point in the next couple decades. The Vision 2030 goal of developing an economy with a far more vibrant private sector that becomes an engine for greater private sector employment of young Saudis over the long term is the right one, as is the time frame of 2030. As Rahm Emanuel once famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Saudi leaders would be well served to use the current crisis to make the adjustments in their very ambitious reform plan that ensure that it succeeds over the long run. That's in our interests, and that's in the interests of Saudi Arabia as well. So what we did in the analytical section of this report is zero in on the 10 Vision 2030 objectives that we thought were most critical to the end goal of a more dynamic and diversified private sector. For each of these objectives, we looked first at Vision 2030's own benchmarks for 2020 and whether Saudi Arabia was meeting these benchmarks. Then we zoomed out and looked at other available economic data and global surveys in the area of focus. So, for example, one Vision 2030 objective is improving the functioning and capability of government capacity. A difficult thing to measure, but we started by looking at the government's 2020 targets or KPIs. In terms of the government's targets for e-government and transparency, we found that the Saudi government was not going to meet its 2020 benchmarks. We then looked at a global survey that provides a broader measure of government effectiveness, the World Bank's Global Governance Indicators. It showed some advances and some setbacks for Saudi Arabia in governance overall. So our evaluation of Saudi progress in this area was somewhat negative. We did the same thing for 9 other Vision 2030 objectives, and I won't go through them with you today, but they're in the report. Along the way, we found some important success stories, but also many instances where Saudi Arabia was falling way behind its 2020 benchmarks. Let me briefly summarize what we found overall. For those who followed Saudi Arabia closely for any length of time, this will come as no surprise, but the social changes happening right now within the kingdom are very noteworthy. Women are getting their licenses to drive. Movie theaters are opening. Rock concerts, Formula One races, and other major entertainment events are being staged. More workplaces are open to women. And perhaps most importantly, the government has stripped the religious police of their legal authority, and they no longer are visible in the streets. Just remarkable progress on the side of social reform. The pace of economic reform is much slower, which should not be entirely surprising given the complicating factors involved in economic reform. The Saudi government, though, has made important progress when it comes to macroeconomic management, the development of capital markets, the banking system, and digitization. However, the government appears to have made less progress in such crucial areas as creating jobs and a broader climate for entrepreneurship, foreign direct investment, and private sector development. Let me flash up one chart that I think captures well the more worrisome aspects of the situation to date. Vision 2030 identifies 4 top-line indicators regarding the growth and development of the private sector. These are really the central objectives in the whole Vision 2030 program. And on the left column, you see the baseline of 2016, where these different measures stood at that time. On the far right-hand side, you see the 2030 goal. And then in the middle, under status, you see where Saudi Arabia is right now. And you see that on most indicators, Saudi Arabia is a long way from achieving its 2030 goals in these key areas. Remember, the primary aim of these reforms is to wean Saudi Arabia of its dependence on oil revenues and create a sustainable economy for future generations. What the government of Saudi Arabia most needs to do is facilitate the development of a diversified private sector so it's no longer so dependent on oil. As we note in the report, Stefan Hertog of London School of Economics recently examined what the Saudi economy would need to look like to have successfully transitioned beyond an oil rentier state. He suggests 2 key developments would be required. First, Saudi Arabia would need to shift an overwhelming majority of its working population from the governmental sector to the private sector. And second, it would need to derive the bulk of its revenues no longer from government oil revenues, but from private sector activity. Both would require a monumental expansion in the private sector. Hertog, for instance, calculates that assuming we had a 5% annual growth rate in the private sector in Saudi Arabia, that it would take 16 years for the government to move enough jobs from the public to the private sector to meet the OECD averages for a typical advanced private sector. And yet to date, we've seen virtually no growth, nowhere near 5% growth in the private sector. Why are we not seeing in data any growth in private sector economic activity, much less the kind of 5% growth that the Saudi Arabia needs for the rapid transition of its private sector to become a real engine of growth for employment in the economy? Let me provide just 6 reasons. First, we found in our view, there was too much emphasis on glitzy mega projects. We were very skeptical of the likelihood of their success. There's not a great record for mega projects in Saudi Arabia, nor the rest of the world. Second, too much focus on high tech. While high tech is alluring and important, Saudi Arabia is not going to succeed in creating the kinds of employment it needs by trying to become right now the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. The Saudi government needs to tailor its policies to the workforce that it has, not the one that it would eventually like to create. Three, too little attention is being paid to the mundane work required to build a private sector. Establishing legal and regulatory frameworks, eliminating bureaucratic hurdles, simplifying exporting and importing, creating mechanisms for adjudicating disputes, in a word, improving business conditions for private firms are simply critical. Fourth, right now the approach is too top-down. The Saudi government needs to cede some of its dominant role in the economy to the marketplace. The government is trying to create new sectors in the hopes that Saudi Arabia will develop a comparative advantage in these areas. The Saudi economy, however, will thrive when its private firms find competitive niches for themselves in global supply chains. This is a task that we feel is better left to savvy business leaders than to bureaucrats. The private sector right now services the government. The government needs to instead become the enabler of a private sector-led economy. This will be the best way of harnessing the talents of the entire Saudi population. Fifth, foreign direct investment, foreign technology, and foreign know-how will be indispensable to the Saudi economy's success. Foreign firms at the moment appear very eager to do business with Saudi Arabia, given its immense wealth, but they appear less willing to risk their own capital with long-term investments on the ground in Saudi Arabia. In order to attract foreign investors, the Saudi government will have to strengthen the rule of law. Investors will need to know that there's greater political accountability from the Saudi leadership before they're going to be willing to risk their own capital within Saudi Arabia. Finally, as part of the Saudi reform effort, the government has concentrated significant economic power in the Public Investment Fund, the PIF. The underlying idea behind this, that the PIF can help seed private sector growth, is not a bad one, but the PIF is now playing multiple roles without a lot of transparency. It owns large portions of the Saudi economy, is engaged in a broad range of financial diplomacy, is procuring a number of high-tech gems for Saudi Arabia, such as shares in Uber or its venture with SoftBank, and economic trophies like the potential purchase of the Premier League team Newcastle. The PIF should have two purposes and two purposes alone, in our view: to grow the nation's existing oil wealth for the benefit of the next generation through a diversified global investment portfolio, and second, to provide financing for the nascent domestic private sector on a transparent and competitive basis without choosing particular firms or sectors as national champions. Saudi Arabia has a rare window of opportunity to implement such wide-ranging reforms. Because of the uncertainties associated with the future of oil markets, it may have less than a decade to shift its economy away from its current dependence on oil. The Saudi government should seize on this window of opportunity, and in our view, it should use this current crisis to make the necessary course corrections to ensure that Vision 2030, a very noble and ambitious plan, meets with every success that has been intended. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. We're now going to turn to our panelists for their questions and a few comments. Fahad, I'd like to start with you. Fahad Nazar is the spokesperson for the Saudi Embassy in Washington, a position he's held since early 2019. Previously, he was affiliated with the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and the English language Saudi newspaper Arab News. It's only fitting that we, would have you on this panel to give a response. So Fahad, you look at these issues, of course, from the perspective of a Saudi government representative. First, do you have any response to this, to our presentation or to this report? And in the context of these findings and recommendations, do you anticipate there are specific ways that the Vision 2030 plan might change, given the coronavirus pandemic and another collapse in oil prices?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me to be on this very important panel and for organizing it. It's a pleasure to be among such a distinguished panel of experts. It's also good to see several familiar faces, including Dr. Thompson, who, if I recall correctly, was probably the last person that I saw in person before we had the lockdown here in DC went into effect. So it's good to see him and to see some of the other panelists as well. So when you talk about Vision 2030, I think 2 points are worth underscoring. The first is that when the vision was unveiled in 2016, it was unveiled after an extensive survey of the economic, demographic, and social landscape of the kingdom that in many ways highlighted our strength, our comparative advantage, as well as our untapped potential. The vision also drew on the lessons and the missteps of the past. So its various elements and programs are intended to meet the needs and to fill the aspirations of the Saudi people. I think the word aspirations is worth stressing here. It was designed with the understanding that oil prices are likely to continue to experience volatility in the future. It was also designed with the understanding that the global economy would probably experience periodic downturns. So, having said that, the main pillars are meant to withstand whatever outside factors are happening around the kingdom. So, what does that mean? That means that regardless of the price of oil, regardless of the state of the global economy, Saudi Arabia will continue and is continuing to invest in its youth through education and training programs. Our efforts will continue to diversify the economy so that we are not as dependent as we once were on the energy sector. We will continue to empower women so that they can succeed both at the workplace and at home. We will continue to streamline our regulations to transform the private sector to become the engine of our economy. We will also continue to work on government efficiency. We are also very keen on creating and fostering an ecosystem that enables small and medium enterprises to thrive. We are also committed to staying the path of sustainable development and attracting direct foreign investment and foreign talent by improving the quality of life for both Saudis and for non-Saudis alike. These are pillars of the vision. They are not likely to change under any circumstance. Now, having said all that, the vision is a blueprint. It has, as you and Stephen both stressed, it has various programs. These programs are under continuous evaluation. So we fully anticipate that some of the programs will achieve their goals before others, and that's perfectly fine. We are also aware that we might need to modify some of these programs as they're being implemented, and that's good, I think, because it shows that we are being flexible and that we're being pragmatic. I think we need. It's very important that we do so, because as both of you made clear, the vision does have a lot of moving parts, but overall, we are certainly moving forward regardless of the strain that the global economy and oil prices have come under because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, just on that last note, are there areas that you think, in the spirit of that flexibility and, keeping the plans under continuous evaluation, are there areas where you think the implementers will push forward in this economic crisis, that they, might see some opportunity here, and other aspects that you think, maybe will be put on the back burner and addressed in a couple of years, but not so much during the pandemic and economic crisis?
I mean, these main pillars will continue going forward. So, as your report noted, there are many areas that are moving forward, and we have made great strides toward that will not stop, and regardless of the pressures that we or the global economy faces. So, as your report noted, we have indeed made great strides towards greater fiscal balance by increasing non-oil revenues. Unemployment has actually gone down. It was going down certainly in 2019, and there is no disputing the fact that we have the employment of women has increased significantly over the past couple of years. In fact, I think your report says and notes that the vision is on track to meet some of its targets for increasing the rate of female participation in the workplace. At the same time, it is also worth noting that the World Bank ranked Saudi Arabia actually as the most improved nation when it comes to ease of doing business. This is globally the same thing. I think the World Bank also, in its annual report on women, business, and the law, ranked Saudi Arabia as the most improved nation when it comes to implementing new reforms for women. This is obviously due to the landmark reforms that we have passed over the past 5 years that have empowered women and have enabled them to work in every sector of the economy. It has enabled them to travel and to study all sorts of disciplines. This is, again, a credit, I think, to the programs that we have in place. We have also, I think, not to be overlooked, we have put an emphasis on the importance of small and medium enterprises in our economy. And I think your report notes that we have already met expectations in terms of increasing the number of small and medium enterprises on our stock market. So in some regards, we are meeting some of our own benchmarks. And as I said at the outset, we fully anticipate that some goals will be achieved faster than others, but that's perfectly fine and reasonable to expect.
Thank you, Fahad.
Thank you.
I have several questions for you, but I'm going to do a round with all of the panelists, and then we'll come back. So next, I'd like to move to Dr. Yasmin Farouk. Yasmin is a visiting fellow at the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Yasmin studied political science at Cairo University and Sciences Po, and was a Fulbright Fellow at Yale University during her postdoctoral studies. At Carnegie, Yasmin's research focuses on Saudi Arabia and regional foreign relations. So Yasmin, politically, do you see opportunities in this moment to move forward the vision plan? Do you anticipate that this crisis may strengthen or weaken the government's mandate and popular support for the tough economic reforms that are to come?
Hi, Catherine. Thank you very much for hosting me. And I would like to congratulate you again on this report, you and Steve. It's not always very easy to, assess such big projects. The answer to your question really depends on which part of the plan are you talking about. The plan has many pillars, and as you said, many projects. And there are some aspects of this plan, whether economic, social, or when it comes to governance, that started actually before Vision 2030 and already had a base of support inside Saudi Arabia. And I think that an aspect like the governance, improving governance, for example, is something that Saudi Arabia will need to continue and something that will continue to have support. And I think that because, I noticed that there's a difference between how we assess here from DC the vision and its progress, and how people inside Saudi Arabia, or if you're based in Saudi Arabia, or if you're talking about Saudi citizens, how they assess the vision and what kind of components do they support and what kind of components they don't support. So, for example, while Steve highlighted that there has been a setback when it comes to governance and government efficiency, for example, in May, I think the Edelman barometer was published, and marked an increase in the trust of the government because of its management of the COVID crisis. So, if you're going to assess support or not, progress or not, it's very important to see, who's assessing and compared to whom. And again, to answer your question, I think the government is trying to show the public right now that the vision is going to continue, for better or for worse. And I think that on some of the aspects of it, there has been a learning curve, and maybe this learning curve will help, absorb some of the political context in order to help this vision move forward. Um, I know that your report and your question had to do mainly with the economic part of it that has been facing many setbacks, and because of the economic crisis. And I would like here to highlight that, for if you're not going to talk about the government or the social aspect, but more the economic aspect, I see that it might be problematic, not only for the reasons that you mentioned in the report, that Stephen has mentioned, but also for, as you have asked me in your question, for political reasons. First of all, a lot of the reforms in the economy and a lot of Vision 2030 in general has been very much politicized. It was supposed to be a national vision, but there has been some kind of construction of a cult of personality around the vision, that this is the project of, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and this is the project of this era. And so the lines in support, in terms of giving political support from the public or even from inside the state to it, has been, the same line of political divisions that are existing, whereas it would have been better to be, more inclusive of everybody and present it really as a national plan. So first, this politicization, I see it as something that may make the support to the continuation of economic reforms, especially those that will have a direct impact on the daily lives of Saudis, as being a little bit problematic. Second of all, as I just said, and linked to this first factor, the vision hasn't been really inclusive in its making or definition of problems, in the sense that it has defined this, monolithic mass called the youth in Saudi Arabia, and has defined, what the problems of the Saudi economy and how to help this youth that is supposed to support the vision, or actually was presumed to support the vision. But now, as the vision is becoming costly for them, I am not sure that the people who did not, participate in the definition of the problem and of the solution are going to continue supporting it. Third, whether we like it or not, there has been heavy-handed repression in Saudi Arabia in the past few years. And again, this heavy-handed repression makes it, hard for people to express, criticism, but also may, make them support even less repression, in addition to economic hardship that it would take to continue implementing Vision 2030. Fourthly, from the political elements that I see that might, hamper the support to the visions, especially the painful measures in the vision for citizens, is that I saw in a recent poll by Ipsos, but also, in reading in the press and analyzing social media and making interviews, that there is still an expectation that, the current economic measures that are actually linked to progress in Vision 2030, meaning reducing dependence on the state, reforming social security system, reforming the wage system in the public sector, and so on and so forth. People are still expecting this to be something temporary, that this is not permanent, that this is not going to be the vision for the long term. And so this may hamper the political support, especially that the state did walk back some of these measures that were applied before, meaning reducing, subsidies and reducing allowances and bonuses. Fifth, there is more information available online now for Saudi citizens to help them, ask questions about the vision and about, big projects that Stephen talked about and whether this is the best thing to do or not. There has been more and more, dissident voices online and abroad that are trying to increase the discussion about those economic reforms and the hardship that they will mean for regular Saudis. And the sixth element I would identify as making, political support to this vision problematic is that the pandemic actually opened a couple of debates that were somehow helping with the political support to the vision and muting any kind of criticism to it. The first one of them is that I noticed, a growing debate about the privatization component in the vision, especially when it comes to the health sector. I have seen, a number of articles saying, this pandemic has proven how important it is for the state to continue being in charge of the health sector. And maybe we should think again about the privatization of the health sector as included in Vision 2030. The other element that was very helpful in mobilizing the people in support of the vision, and most importantly, in muting criticism, because a lot of people didn't need mobilization in support of the vision, they were supporting the vision. But there was a hyper-nationalism in Saudi Arabia that helped mute any kind of criticism to Vision 2030 that is right now being discussed in Saudi official media openly. This kind of nationalism that made any kind of criticism to national policies as being, some kind of a treason or some kinds of not being patriotic enough. Right now in Saudi Arabia, there is a pushback that actually was kind of triggered by the state's management of COVID-19, a pushback that, no, we can criticize Vision 2030, we can criticize state policies while remaining patriotic and while remaining supportive to our country.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. That was very helpful. And just really quickly, I just wanted to touch on one additional point. You wrote recently in an article that the paternalistic and humane framing of the king's decisions to treat millions of foreigners living in the country as part of Saudi society pushes back against a growing hostility towards expatriates and naturalized citizens living in the kingdom, talking about the context of the COVID-19 crisis. This line stood out to me because you hear a lot in the conversation around coronavirus and foreign labor markets in the Gulf, especially. That conversation is centered around the ways of expatriate workers that are likely to lose their jobs or have already lost their jobs and will return to their home countries. Do you see a different scenario unfolding in Saudi Arabia, or is that comment not tied to expatriate workers leaving the country?
So I think last week, Bloomberg published a report, the Jadwa, already saying that the trend of, foreign workers leaving Saudi Arabia has already started. I think that there is an estimation that by the end of 2020, around 9% of employees in the kingdom would be leaving, 9% of the workforce will be leaving, because these are actually the 1.2 million that the report expected will be leaving Saudi Arabia because of the economic crisis by the end of 2020. Also, you have to remember that the number of expatriates in public and private sector in Saudi Arabia, per official numbers, make up to 76.8% of the total workforce. And if you talk only about the private sector, that will be 75% of the labor in the private sector being foreign. So this is why I find it hard to see that, there will be a massive exodus, at least, seen on one phase, or that all of them will suddenly disappear. I'm not sure that foreign labor is going to be completely absent. And of course, I would love to, and there are better experts on this panel to talk to this, but I do not have this expectation, especially that I think it also will depend on what the government will do to encourage the private sector that so far has been resisting, some of the Saudization policies. What is the government going to do in order to, incentivize them to give the jobs left by foreigners to Saudis? And I think the government, needs to balance between, on the one hand, the population that is very much supportive of its Saudization policy, but also has some kind of expectation, in terms of wages and in rights, even if the expectations are today tempered and will continue to be tempered. But the government needs to balance this with a private sector that will already be hurting from an economic crisis. And honestly, the government, since the start of COVID, has been trying to play this balance. I've seen it, in discussions in the Shura Council, but in new regulations that have been adopted to, make the hirement of, but also the firing of Saudis in the private sector less costly and more flexible. But to go back to what I wrote, and I wrote this, in what I call the first phase of the management of the COVID crisis in Saudi Arabia, which to me went on until the beginning of May, when the focus was mainly on managing the health crisis more than emphasizing the economic cost of it. I wrote about this mainly because it is true that, again, as I mentioned in my previous answer, there was an ascendance of this hyper-nationalism of Saudi Arabia that was very much exclusionary and very much negative when it came to foreign labor and to expats in the labor market in Saudi Arabia. There were slogans such as, Saudi Arabia for Saudis, for example, that were, encouraging this kind of negative sentiment. And because of the king's narrative, his first speech during the COVID-19 and the measures that were taken to manage the public health crisis, there was a pushback against this hyper-nationalism, recognizing that, foreign labor and expats living in the country are part of the problem and part of the solution as well. And this is why I said that this is a change that pushed back. And as I told you, I have noticed this in articles in media, and the media in Saudi Arabia is controlled, where people started saying, see, the state itself is not that negative, is not that exclusionary of the foreign labor. I am not saying that the hyper-nationalist trend and that the negative sentiment towards foreign labor are not there. They are still there, and you read articles that are very, very aggressive. But you also have now another camp saying it is not okay. This is not a balanced view. It didn't help also that until I think earlier this week, the number of COVID patients were higher amongst foreigners than amongst Saudis, and mainly in labor camps. It's only at the beginning of this week that they started becoming, more balanced, and even with the number of Saudis of new cases higher than the number of non-Saudis. So in this sense, this is what I wrote about, that the state is pushing for, tempering this hyper-nationalism towards non-Saudis, and we're seeing it right now even unfolding even in a bigger scale.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Next, we're going to turn to Sarah Lechtenberg-Kasten. Sarah joins us today from Riyadh, where she is a research fellow in the Energy Transitions and Electric Power Program at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, often known as CAPSARC. Sarah has been a fellow at CAPSARC since 2015 and previously worked as a U.S. Foreign Service officer and as a social scientist at the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command Analysis Center. Thank you again, Sarah, for joining us today. So Sarah, to start us off, Saudi Arabia benefits, as we mentioned, from being the lowest cost producer in the world and likely will be the last, could envision a scenario in which Saudi Arabia is the last producer left standing. And yet, recent oil price collapses in 2014 and 2020 have prompted the kingdom to recognize that its current economic model is unsustainable over the long term, despite statements by senior officials that they're not particularly concerned about warnings of peak oil coming anytime soon. What is your opinion of this window that Saudi Arabia has to transform its economy from reliance on the price of oil?
So thanks, Catherine, for having me on the panel, and congratulations on the report. I guess what I would stress here is I want to reinforce what Dr. Farouk had just mentioned. that this discussion of, over reliance on oil revenues is, and the concern that such a huge part of the national budget is from oil production, that's been going on for quite some time. So it's not, easy to pinpoint an exact date, but the main thing is that, as Mr. Nasser has said, the work on diversification has been going on for quite some time, and before Vision 2030 was established. But those low oil prices and, an ambitious leadership style help to kind of bring things together. I'd also like to reinforce the additional statement on the importance of small and medium enterprises, and the role that, the education system with King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, the way they're promoting incubators so that really brilliant young students can launch a new technology product and then have that mentoring from an entrepreneurial approach to get it into the market. So I think that this diversification began earlier, and we have to realize that those type of skills and those type of approaches, it's going to be very difficult to move away from an oil market and oil revenues alone. So inshallah, as we would say, we're going to be seeing the benefits, and also diversification with regard to tourism. One of the cool things that was reported today was the announcement of the route for the 2021 Dakar Road Rally. So that happened this year in Saudi Arabia. It's just one example of how tourism will likely become a larger part of the overall economy, and hopefully, taking advantage of this time of COVID when tourism is not going to be happening, to figure out how to build up the capacity of local providers to attract many of the pilgrims that go to Hajj and some of those niche tourists that really want to experience this culture of Saudi Arabia and see kind of the Lawrence of Arabia style traditions that are still in place.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I have a related question. Saudi Arabia, as part of the effort to sort of rationalize the budget in some ways, has reduced a lot of energy subsidies, including on electricity and gasoline, to deburden the state budget and reduce some of the distortions in the domestic energy markets. At one point, planning to eliminate energy subsidies by 2025. How have you seen these policies and their results so far? Do you think they're effective or sustainable? Or is there a point when Saudis are going to feel that it is too much of a burden? I think you might be muted.
Some of the research that CAPSARC has done in the past has been in support of studies on energy price reform. And when I got this question, I reached out to one of my colleagues who did months and months of studies running models, and some of it was intergenerational studies on what needs to be done now so as to protect the wealth of future generations. And I got a little bit concerned, but he said, hey, Sarah, just simplify it and let's remind people that short-term pain and some of the pressure points for removing subsidies will end up with long-term gain and protecting the overall future of Saudi Arabia. So it's not simply from a budgetary perspective, but this has had a positive impact on emissions too. And the overall projections are that by 2030, they'll be able to sell or save approximately 2 million barrels of oil a day. So the other secondary or tertiary effects is we joke about the aspect of cultural change. And some of those water cooler discussions are, our consumer behaviors changing. Our Saudi dads throwing out this line of, how should I say it? your dad is coming home in the evening and every light in the house is on. Do Saudi dads get irritated with the kids at the same rate that American dads do? The answer to that is yes. So there is some social change within consumer approaches, but you also see it in things like wanting to buy more efficient appliances, especially with regard to air conditioning. So it's both kind of a micro aspect within household budgets, but also the secondary efficiency aspects too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Our last panelist today is Dr. Mark Thompson. He's a senior associate fellow and the head of the socioeconomic unit at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. He has been an assistant professor at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, also in Saudi Arabia, and he recently published a new book, Being Young, Male, and Saudi, Identity and Politics in a Globalized Kingdom. So Mark, in your new book, you focus on this young Saudi male taking the view that while bringing Saudi women into the workforce and into the public sphere is important, many of these same issues related to the societal transformation and economic changes that Sarah was just talking about affect Saudi youth as a whole. So how do you understand the aspirations of, from your research, how do you understand these aspirations of Saudi youth more broadly in your conversations or in your research? Do you have a picture of how Saudis envisioned the country of the next decade or the next generation? And how does that line up with the aspirations laid out in the Vision 2030?
Okay. Well, good morning. Firstly, Catherine and the Atlantic Council, thank you very much for the invitation and many congratulations on the launching of your report. Yes, I mean, my new book specifically looks at the sort of the views, the aspirations of young Saudi men. But obviously, this, as you just said, this actually informs the complete picture of Saudi youth across the country. And indeed, many of their aspirations are remarkably similar to those of their international peers. I do think, though, we need to be sort of careful here when we start using sort of very generalized terms such as Saudi youth, Saudi women, because obviously, Saudi Arabia is a country of great diversity, and these are not homogenous groups. There's there's great diversity even within cities, for example, or districts. And in fact, when I was doing I did around 50-something focus groups for my last book all over the kingdom, in all areas, and with young people from all walks of life, from different constituencies, whether it was their socioeconomic backgrounds, their educational backgrounds. One thing I heard a lot was that, yes, there is sort of support for Vision 2030, and certainly sort of great initial support in 2016, but there was also a feeling, depending on where I was in the kingdom, that actually there was a sort of a need, if you like, for sort of different visions for different constituencies. And so actually it needed to be a bit more nuanced. So if you take, for instance, the number one issue for most young Saudis, which is, of course, employment, well, yes, you can say that is the most important issue, but actually it varies depending on who, what sort of level of importance or how they define a job, because there are quite clearly some young Saudis who don't want jobs, they want careers, and that's quite different, and there are other young Saudis who want the opportunity to be able to open their own mobile phone shop in Qasim or in somewhere like Wadi Dawasa or what have you. So, so it's not just this sort of one size fits all. And I think we need to sort of be very aware of that. I think what's very interesting about, when we talk about sort of youth aspirations across the kingdom, and then we sort of relate that to Saudi Vision 2030, actually, a lot of what is laid out in Vision 2030 was actually already happening amongst a lot of young people. They had already instigated a lot of this themselves, certainly since the huge growth of social media in the kingdom, sort of post 2009. And all of a sudden, you had a lot of these young Saudis who suddenly had the technical tools to be able to connect to each other, to be able to then to sort of provide the sort of opportunities that weren't provided, whether that was entertainment, whether that was social clubs and things like this. And that was actually something that they did themselves. And this sort of happened bottom up. And so it was very interesting that when the when the vision was launched in April 2016. And of course, I remember sitting with a group of young people in Riyadh and watching this when it was launched. And it was very exciting because this was really something very, very new. It resonated with them, and it seemed to sort of talk to sort of issues that they were concerned about. But as I say, a lot of this was already part of their daily transactions anyway. So, we can certainly think of back in sort of 2012 or sort of 11, 12, when you sort of saw a big explosion of online clubs that were created by young people creating their own content for media sites like YouTube and what have you. And actually then when the vision came along, and then there was more sort of talk of this and there was more support for this, then a lot of these young people actually sort of thought to themselves, hang on a minute. We've created this as a sort of source of entertainment, but actually this is something we could monetize, and this is actually something that we could now actually sort of create our own job or work or what have you. And this obviously sort of runs with what the vision was sort of saying. So I think it's important to realize that, and it's important to realize that a lot of this was already there, and the vision sort of has brought a lot of this out. Yes, were young people excited by this? Without a doubt. My students were enormous. I was teaching at King Fahd University then, as you just mentioned, and my students were enormously sort of supportive of this, and often for there were aspects of the vision that maybe are not really sort of talked about so much, but actually resonated with a lot of young people, like for instance increasing physical activity, which of course that went hand in hand with the sort of the creation of a sort of gym culture, which we've seen in Saudi Arabia over the last couple of years. That was something they picked up on. And also a lot of young people, certainly well-educated young people in tertiary education, they pointed out to me that this was, in a way, was a sort of like a key to a door that had been unlocked, that was basically saying to them, we want you to be ambitious. We want you to go out and lead. We want you to participate. And this was something that really did resonate, because I know when very often people ask me, what is the biggest change that I've seen in Saudi Arabia since I first arrived in sort of January 2001. And for me, the biggest change is this desire of lots of these young people to engage and to be able to participate. And what a lot of young people would sort of say as well is, well, look, the Saudi government has spent, enormous sums of money over the decades on education, whether that's domestic education, whether that's university education, vocational colleges, or sending students overseas on the King Abdullah Scholarship Program, for example. So all of that has been spent. So therefore, it's only logical that sort of human capital is utilized. And so they saw Saudi Vision 2030, if you like, as a vehicle for this. And that's obviously, that without a doubt, there was a sense that this door had opened for them, and that they would also now have more opportunity to go into areas and sectors that maybe in the past they wouldn't have done, because so they were very constrained by the type of careers that they could pursue, either because of sort of social-cultural reasons, or because simply the jobs weren't there. So suddenly I think the fact that students are young people are sort of much better educated, they're much more aware of what's happening, not just in the kingdom, but also in the region and internationally. And also they have this sort of sense that these opportunities are there for them to take. And it's really up to them now to sort of utilize that. I do think as well that this has also sort of sparked amongst lots of young people a sort of an awareness that they can also now have more of an individual identity rather than a collective identity. And that individual identity is something that can be based on their job, their startup, but it can also be based on sort of the cultural or was activities that they're involved in. And as those of you who know Saudi Arabia well will know that this is a very, there is very, very many aspirational young people, entrepreneurial young people who are also highly creative and who very much want to sort of tap into this and be part of it.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, those are very important distinctions. And as you note, there's a lot of desire among your students, among others in Saudi Arabia to have jobs or careers or be entrepreneurs, and yet there's still this gap between both with the participation rate and the unemployment rate. Is this an issue primarily of human capital development? This is something that some of our audience members have submitted questions about workforce training, and I think the phrase used is upskilling the current workforce, or is it something about the jobs that are available? How would you identify that problem and offer some suggestions about whether it's I'm sure there are multiple answers to this, but something about developing the private sector to be a more attractive place for young people to work versus developing skills and education so that the people are more attractive for these companies to hire.
Yes, I mean, this is a very complex topic, and obviously because it covers not just sort of issues to do with the labour market, it covers educational reform, it covers sort of perceptions of public-private sector employment, and there's just multiple issues here. But I think it's obviously, I mean, I think a lot of this is not, if, for example, if you want to increase private sector employment amongst young nationals, then you also then have to start changing the mentality as well. It's not enough to just sort of say, give data and figures and percentages and say we're going to do this. You actually have to make this as something desirable, which I think is very difficult at times, and is not something that you can just click your fingers and do overnight. It's going to take time, and I think it has to start sort of, this is also something that has to be implemented in the educational reform from quite a young age. I mean, I'm glad Sarah, for example, mentioned, mentoring. This is very, very important, not just for people wanting startups, but I think sort of right across the board. Because what I actually find with a lot of my students I used to teach at King Fahd University was actually, most of them wanted to be mentored, but actually a lot of them didn't realize that they did, and that this was actually, that this is there and it needs to be tapped into. So in other words, this sort of the ambitions, the aspirations, they need the correct channels. Because very often, people talk about, for example, startups and everything, and they say, oh, well, the biggest problem for young people is they don't have enough money, or they don't, but actually very often it's not the case, because, there are accelerators, there are incubators. Very often they actually need the people to talk to. They need the know-how. They need this mentoring, which I think is very, very important. Now, in terms of sort of the public-private sector divide, I think this is going to take time. I post my latest book, I mean, I did research related to desirability of public or private sector employment, and I surveyed a whole group of students at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, which of course is sort of a very academic, technical university in the world top 200 in the world. But I also gave the same questions to a group of students at Qasim University. And I basically asked them, if you were offered a job in the public or private sector with the same benefits, the same salary, etc., which one would you take? Now, at King Fahd University, there was a 50-50 split between private and public, which is probably not surprising, although I actually thought it might be more for the private. But at Qasim University, there was a split of 80-20, where you had sort of 80% saying, no, they still wanted public sector employment. And when I delved deeper into this to find out why this was, then the overwhelming response from everybody was job security, and even if I get a job in the public sector and it's a lower salary than one I could get in the private sector, I'm still going to take that one because of job security. So this is, again, you're not to changing mentalities takes time as well, and this is why the education system has to be part of this, because obviously if you want to increase private sector employment, if you want to move Saudis into new sectors and things like this, then you have to also reassure them that actually this is not just going to be viable, but there's going to be security for them, particularly obviously post what we've seen happen this year, when in Saudi Arabia, amongst a lot of young people, there is now this great fear that we've gone back to a post sort of 2014 situation, post the oil price collapse, when of course the labor market contracted severely at that time, as we know. So for a lot of young people now, who are particularly those who are about to graduate or are graduating, not just from universities, but also from vocational colleges, etc., there is this sort of concern that, are we sort of back to that sort of situation? So, I mean, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of work to be done, obviously, in all of these areas. I totally agree with the point that Stephen made earlier on about, and your report makes about, sort of less emphasis, if you like, on the sort of the high profile, glamorous things, and more emphasis on, if you like, the nitty gritty and the nuts and bolts, because that is really what's very important. Because as a lot of young people have said to me, if I'm unemployed and I don't have a job, I can't afford the petrol to drive to the cinema, let alone buy a ticket. And that, this is reality. This is real life, especially when you consider that, the vast majority of the young people that I deal with, they're sort of middle class, lower middle class, and the sort of issues that they're concerned about finding a job. It's vital, because if they can't find a job, they can't afford to house, they can't afford to get married, and sort of all of these sort of things. So these are the really, really critical structural issues.
Thank you, Mark. I think this is a great moment to jump to some of the questions from our audience. We've been getting a lot of really, really great and interesting questions. So I'll start with one that we have gotten from two different attendees that I'll direct towards Steve, because I know this was something that we looked at in the research, but I'd welcome others to jump in. Could you talk a little bit about, we say that need to put less emphasis on the oil sector. What are some of the sectors that Saudi Arabia is aiming to diversify into, or should be aiming to diversify into? Tourism and entertainment are two big ones that are, sort of widely looked at as part of the Vision 2030. But Steve, can you talk a little bit about, in some of our conversations and some of our research, what the different answers we heard to this question, what those looked like?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And maybe I'll start where Mark started, which is that there is this tremendous energy and talent and desire for engagement among younger people. And I think part of the key to future economic success is finding ways to harness that you don't build a private sector from the top down. You build a private sector or by decree. You build a private sector by enabling and encouraging and empowering young people and entrepreneurs to do what they do best, which is to be creative, to experiment, to try to find niches in global supply chains that will make Saudis rich and employable. The government has focused on developing a local entertainment industry, and I think that's a valuable sector. And I think certainly by opening up cinemas and bringing in foreign acts to perform and bringing different kinds of entertainment to the kingdom, there's a lot of room for economic growth in that area, and that there should be small businesses that emerge from that. It's limited in the extent that, once you've sort of given everyone the chance to go to the movies and go to see a concert, I don't think you're going to see a lot of growth beyond that. There aren't going to be a lot of people under current circumstances, I think, coming to Saudi Arabia for entertainment. I just don't see that happening. We haven't talked a lot about the political dimensions of life in Saudi Arabia, but for outsiders, it's just not an attractive place to go and see a golf tournament. It's not going to be their first desire, is to go to Saudi Arabia to see a golf tournament. Tourism, similarly, there's more money to be made from religious tourism. The move to make historic Islamic sites and pre-Islamic sites to reconstruct them or make them more accessible to the public. That's all, I think, notable and important. And there will be people, a niche group of tourists who will be very interested and should be very interested in that offering. But I don't see tourism writ large being a big growth industry. Like, I don't see people flocking to Saudi Arabia in ways that they have maybe to the UAE, just given the political and still social restrictions on visitors. Government in Vision 23 talks a lot about Saudi Arabia being a sort of a crossroads of worlds, bridging different civilizations, being a logistical hub for commerce, or an economic crossroads between Europe and Asia. I think that area is fairly, it's already taken. All the vision plans in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia is not the only country in the Gulf to have a vision plan. Most of the Gulf countries have a vision plan, and they all see themselves playing that kind of role. And the UAE, to be frank, is just way out in front, and I think has largely captured that market. The government's also interested in downstream industries that build off of their natural advantage in oil, so chemicals, plastics, things like that. That seems to make a lot of sense. But again, I think what we saw as we talked to people, and particularly as we talked to experts, is the top-down nature of reforms right now are not going to get the Saudi economy to where it needs to be. There needs to be much more space for private sector actors, and you're not going to have the private sector invest, particularly foreign investors invest, when the government's such a big player. Who's going to come in and invest in theaters if the government's part of that business already? You're competing against the state. That just doesn't work. And the other missing piece is this rule of law piece. If there's a feeling that I, as a foreigner, am not going to get the same chances in a court of law that a member of the royal family might, I'm not going to invest my money. It's as simple as that.
Thanks, Steve. Sort of on a similar note, I'd like to turn back to Fahad and talk about, so this question came in and was specifically focused on tourism, but I think it is applicable to a variety of sectors and different parts of the vision plan. So the question is about the ministries that are overseeing, tourism or entertainment, or different sectors that the Vision 2030 is investing in. Have you seen in those ministries an awareness and a plan for boosting these investments that are needed, both foreign investments and others, to expand some of these sectors?
Right. So I think it is important to focus on the entertainment and the tourism sectors for two reasons. One is the fact that they really highlight the foresight that our leadership had, because frankly speaking, if you had spoken about either of those industries or sectors 2 years ago, they simply didn't exist. As Stephen said correctly, a few years ago, nobody would have thought of going to Saudi Arabia for tourism. And for us as Saudis, when we thought of entertainment, we immediately thought of, well, we have to find it somewhere else. So our leadership looked at that, looked at the potential that was there, and essentially created two sectors from the ground up. So, and there has been tremendous appeal. Now, eventually, we do want people from around the world to come, and that has actually begun happening. We issued tourist visas for the first time last year, and we've had tens of thousands of people from all over the world, from the U.S., from Europe, from China, and India come in, because we know that there's a lot of things to see in Saudi Arabia. We have a lot of natural treasures in the form of pristine beaches and mountains and caves and other sites. We do have archaeological and ancient historic sites that people are very much interested in. In fact, UNESCO has designated 5 different sites as World Heritage Sites in Saudi Arabia. So that's one. In addition, the tourism sector, as everybody knows, still remains very much labor intensive. So it has the potential to employ hundreds of thousands of Saudis, and in fact, it has already begun to employ tens of thousands, and that potential is still there. The same applies to entertainment, to the entertainment sector. Again, it was built from the ground up. It has the potential to employ thousands, hundreds of thousands of Saudis. Again, it is very labor intensive. And the thing that we have to understand is that Saudi Arabia has a pretty large, or relatively large population. So our domestic market is much bigger than certainly most of our neighbors. So our population is around 33 million people as we speak. And that's a pretty sizable market for not just our local investors in Saudi Arabia, but obviously we've had a lot of foreign investors, especially in entertainment and the tourism sectors worldwide, that see the potential of both of those sectors to not just to employ people, but to generate billions of dollars of revenues in the kingdom.
Thank you, Fahad. Yasmin, I think you wanted to make a comment about entertainment as well.
Sorry, thank you. So I think beyond just the fact of whether entertainment, as discussed by Steve and Fahad, whether the right sector or not to put investments and to develop in Saudi Arabia, I just had a comment that it's not just about the choice of sectors sometimes in Vision 2030. And I think that this is something you highlight very well on the report with Steve. It's also about the implementation and what kind of policies and how are policies implemented. So if you take the entertainment, for example, the entertainment sector has been a very interesting to watch in Saudi Arabia because there has been a learning curve, but a learning curve that was due to social reaction that was not able to be tamed by the state. And it was not just from Islamists or opponents who opposed entertainment. Like a couple of weeks ago, the Shura Council was discussing that even when it comes to economic objectives from the entertainment sector, such as Saudization, such as spending economically, given that for now the entertainment sector is still not generating profit, that even these objectives are still not applied and are not implemented. And then you have the political side of it, that sometimes the mere criticism of something like entertainment, you're not criticizing anything political here, is sometimes repressed. So it's even in the implementation of the policies sometimes that cause a problem, and not just starting with the definition of which sector we're going to develop. Sorry.
Thanks, Yasmin. Sarah, I'll turn back to you. Apologies. Yasmin, I actually had a question pulled for you from the Q&A box as well. Could you talk about the implications of the Vision 2030 agenda and sort of the successes or setbacks it's had for the kingdom's neighbors like UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and others?
So honestly, off the top of my head, and I think this is something that you mentioned very well in your report, that it is still very early to judge, because again, Saudi Arabia is on many aspects of the vision catching up with other countries around it. That's one. Second of all, there is really a huge difference in size. So in order for Vision 2030 to be able to achieve some of its objectives that will have direct implications on its neighbors, it's going to take more time. But for example, one of the things that again gets us back to entertainment, and something that you hear immediately from Saudis and from people around, is that the number of Saudis who used to, quote unquote, escape and go to Bahrain over the weekend and go to the Emirates over the weekend, now actually stay in Saudi Arabia if there are events that are, organized, and if the events are accessible and affordable. Because again, that goes back to the way policies are implemented. Sometimes these policies are too expensive for the large sector of Saudi citizens to benefit from, or it is not actually the Saudi taste. It is, again, something that is foreign to them. So not only Saudis are not necessarily going to Bahrain or to the Emirates, but I have myself, met foreigners who, for the sake of the fun of it, decided to leave Bahrain or the UAE over the weekend and go to Saudi Arabia to discover, those new events and visit those new sites. So I guess in terms of some tourism and entertainment, it sometimes has an impact on neighboring countries. But when it comes to what Steve mentioned of becoming a regional hub for logistics, for transport, it still is, other countries in the region are still more important, such as the UAE, but also in terms of political stability is still not helping Saudi Arabia develop this aspect of Vision 2030.
Thank you, Yasmin. So I'm conscious that we're running close to the end of our time, and I just wanted to give each of our speakers, we'll run in the same order, a chance to give 1 minute or less on their final points from today. Fahad, can we start with you?
Sure. So thank you very much again for inviting me, Catherine, and for holding this panel. So Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia represents, it's a very exciting time for Saudis. It is a transformation in every sense of the word. When Saudis think, again, it's, I think, important to note that the overwhelming majority of the Saudi population is very young. It is very well educated. It's under 70% of it is under 35. It is, as Dr. Thompson said, that they are increasingly more educated, better educated. They are well traveled. They're well connected, and they see Vision 2030 and all its various elements as a tremendous opportunity for them to not just excel internally, but also to help in projects that frankly have a global impact. So when we're talking about our scientists, our doctors, they are looking not just to improve healthcare and education and science in the kingdom, but we are well aware and have fully embraced the fact that we live in a global economy. We want to do everything, obviously, we can to fully develop all these various sectors of the Saudi economy, but we are also working closely with our partners here in the United States, in Europe, and in other countries to develop solutions to so many of the challenges that face us. I think, obviously, the COVID pandemic that we're all facing now is a prime example. So Saudi Arabia has embraced globalism. We want to work as closely as possible with our partners to come up with global solutions to essentially what are a lot of these issues that we face are global challenges and require global solutions to be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahad. Yasmin?
I think maybe two final points. First of all, that again, as I said, there is still a need for the vision to become more inclusive and not just in the sense of picking the instances of or the reactions that gain traction by discussions on a larger scale, but actually, and this is something you highlight in your report, by seeking the participation of the people involved. The human capital is not at the center of Vision 2030, and it needs to be. And again, this is something that you highlight. Second of all, and maybe I'll be going way against the current here, I think there is an overemphasis on what privatization, private sector, and private, labor in the private sector is going to do for Saudi Arabia. I think that there is a need to dig deeper into this and to dig deeper in parallel into how can you also make sure that you will get the best talent to work also for the government, to work also for the bureaucracy that is supposed to implement this kind of vision. And again, it gets us back to the human capital. This is very important, and I think this should be the center.
Thank you, Yasmin. Sarah, we'll turn to you for any last comments.
Sure. So CAPSARC, in conjunction with the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, just wrapped up a 3-day Think Tank 20 workshop. And throughout the discussions with think tanks all over the globe, we touched on issues that we've covered in this presentation. And it just is a kind of a one little data point on, a component of Vision 2030 that called for greater openness, greater collaboration, and making sure that our young people are involved on this public stage. So it was a great opportunity to work on that effort. But the overall sense, that I get from my colleagues is Vision 2030 is a grand vision, and it's not going to be possible to, get a report card at the end, especially after just a few years, and say, hey, we hit 100% of our targets. So, but in essence, this has changed the DNA of social relations and economic relations, and for the better. So the view is to keep on endeavoring to meet the overarching goals.
Thank you, Sarah. Mark, we'll turn to you. I think you might still be.
Yes,
there you are.
No, thank you. Yes, I mean, I would agree, for example, with what Yasmin was just saying about sort of the human capital being the center of this. I can remember, one of my students saying to me, for example, that the Vision 2030 should be about the individual. The individual is Vision 2030. I think this is very, very true. And I think in terms of when you do have, as Farhad was saying about, such a young population, I mean, and you think of other countries in the world, like Japan, for example, who would love to have this young, aspirational, entrepreneurial population, and the possibilities that this brings. But then that brings me back to, the point I made earlier about obviously, tailoring, the education system, mentoring and things like this, so that you can actually harness all of this. I mean, I know sometimes people would come and visit me at the university and I would sort of say, I'd point to one of my classes and I'd say, there's your Vision 2030. It's sitting there, and that's when, and sort of being able to sort of tap into that, because there is no doubt that as Stephen was saying, the energy, the potential, the entrepreneurial mindset, all of this is there as raw material, if you like, and it needs to be used.
Thank you, Mark. Steve, do you have any last words before we log off?
Sure. I mean, thanks to the panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I've learned a lot from this conversation. I just wanted to sort of re-emphasize what I think is the top line message of the report. We think that Vision 2030 is a good thing for Saudi Arabia. It's a good thing for the United States. It has helped create a social transformation in Saudi Arabia that's very important. As we went around and toured different government ministries in Saudi Arabia, it was clear there are a lot of different programs, a lot of different initiatives associated with Vision 2030. More importantly, a lot of talented and very well-meaning public officials trying to make this work. And I guess part of our message today is 4 years into this reform program, I think it's a good moment to sort of look and say, where are we in terms of where we want to be in 2030, just a decade from now, as we look at the future of oil and the future of the region more broadly, and how do we get to where we want to be? And I think it's a moment for some deep thought as to how one makes a course correction to get you there. Because if you look at the raw economic numbers with regard to private sector growth and private sector employment, it's just not moving at the moment. And that has to move for both political and economic reasons over the long term. And we would love to be part of the conversation as Saudis grapple with that challenge.
Thank you, everyone. That's all we have for today. I'd encourage you to check out the report online, and a recording of this event will be available on the event page where you registered as soon as we finish. Thank you again, everyone, all of the panelists and everyone in the audience as well.